Hi there. I'm going to read chapter 32, the final chapter of Lila, an Inquiry into Morals by Robert M. Pirsig. It was going to take a while to get all this sorted out. An hour ago he was planning to spend the rest of his life taking care of Lila. As of this minute, he was never going to see her again. Wham! Wham! Just like that. His mind felt like the beach out here, all full of old tires and derelict hulls and bleach bottles, after the hurricane had passed through. He guessed what he needed now was some time and silence to get back to where he was before. All these events seemed to have completely cut off his past. Whatever was gone. It was really behind him. The ocean was right here now, just on the other side of the sand barrier. Here, now. This was a whole new life starting. Soon there'd be no trace of this ever having been here. The boat swung a little in the breeze. It seemed empty now, silent. He was all alone again. It was as though Lila had never been here. He supposed he should be overjoyed. He didn't know why he felt so down. This was what he wanted. He should be celebrating. But it was really sad that she had to end it like that. Why did she tell Rigel he was trying to kill her? That was really bad. She knew he wasn't trying to kill her. Her whole attitude when she talked to him wasn't the attitude of someone who thought that. Of course, he never heard her say he was going to kill her. He just heard Rigel say she said it. But Rigel wouldn't have lied about something like that. She must have said something of the sort. What made it so sad was it was the first really immoral thing she had done to him in all that time he was with her. Sure, she called him a lot of bad names and stuff. But that had been more a defense of herself than any overt wickedness. She had just been trying to tell him the truth, but this time she was lying. That's why she wanted to get out of here so fast. It was the first time he'd ever seen her look down like that. That's what was so sad to see. The thing that was most attractive about her was that straightforward, eyes-ahead look of someone who's honest with himself, whatever others might think. Now that was gone. It meant she was turning back to the static pattern she came from. She's sold out. The system beat her. It's made a crook out of her at last. It was as though she had just one more step to take, and she was out of hell forever. And then instead of taking that one step, she turned back. Now she's really done for. That bastard will commit her for life. Anyway, Pheadrus supposed he would have to get busy and get ready to leave tomorrow. He'd get everything set to head out at daybreak. Possibly he could make it all the way to Barnegat Inlet, if he could get in there. He'd have to look at the charts again. Somehow he didn't feel like moving. He didn't feel like doing anything. He supposed he shouldn't be so hard on Lila. What happened to her was very scary stuff. If she wants to go back to some place she thinks is safer, who's to blame her? The funny thing was that when she said he was trying to kill her, that was insane. But it wasn't entirely incorrect. He was trying to kill her, not the biological Lila, but the static patterns that were really going to kill her if she didn't let go. From the static point of view, the whole escape into dynamic quality seems like a death experience. It's a movement from something to nothing. How can nothing be any different from death? Since a dynamic understanding doesn't make the static distinctions necessary to answer that question, the question goes unanswered. All the Buddha could say was, see for yourself. When early Western investigators first read the Buddhist texts, they too interpreted nirvana as some kind of suicide. There's a famous poem that goes, while living, be a dead man, be completely dead, and then do as you please, and all will be well. It sounds like something from a Hollywood horror film, but it's about nirvana. The Metaphysics of Quality translates it, while sustaining biological and social patterns. Kill all intellectual patterns. Kill them completely. And then follow dynamic quality, and morality will be served. Lila was still moving toward dynamic quality. All life does. This breakup of her life's patterns looked like it was part of that movement. When Pheadrus first went to India, he'd wondered why, if this passage of enlightenment into pure dynamic quality was such a universal reality. Did it only occur in certain parts of the world and not others? At the time, he thought this was proof that the whole thing was just Oriental religious baloney, the equivalent of a magic land called heaven that Westerners go to if they are good and get a ticket from the priests. Now he saw that enlightenment is distributed in all parts of the world, just as the color yellow is distributed in all parts of the world. But some cultures accept it and others screen out recognition of it. Lila probably will never know what's happened to her, and neither will Rigel or anyone else. She'll probably go through the rest of her life thinking this whole episode had been some kind of failure, when in fact what had happened might not have been a failure but growth. Maybe if Rigel hadn't shown up, she would have killed all the bad patterns right here in Sandy Hook, but it's too late to ever know. Strange that she'd come to Kingston on a boat called the Karma. It was unlikely anyone aboard knew what that word really meant. It was like naming a boat causal relationship. Of all the hundreds of Sanskrit words he had learned so long ago, dharma and karma had hung on the longest and hardest. You could translate and pigeonhole the others, but these never seemed to stop needing translating. The Metaphysics of Quality translated karma as evolutionary garbage. That's why it sounded so funny as the name of a boat. It seemed to suggest she had arrived in Kingston on a garbage scow. Karma is the pain, the suffering, the results from clinging to the static patterns of the world. The only exit from the suffering is to detach yourself from these static patterns, that is, to kill them. A common way taken to kill them is suicide, but suicide only kills biological patterns. That's like destroying a computer because you can't stand the program it's running. The social and intellectual patterns that cause the suicide have to be carried on by others. From an evolutionary point of view, that's really a backward and therefore immoral step. Another immoral way of killing the static patterns is to pass the patterns to someone else, in what Pheadrus called a karma dump. You invent a devil group, Jews or blacks or whites or capitalists or communists, it doesn't matter. Then say that group is responsible for all your suffering, and then hate it and try to destroy it. On a daily personal level, everyone has things or people they hate and blame for their suffering, and this hatred and blame brings a kind of relief. Back in Kingston, Rigel's whole breakfast sermon was a karma dump. Lila's accusation just now was another one. That's what made it so sad. She'd received too much karmic garbage in her life, and she couldn't handle it, and that's what was making her crazy. And now she's dumped some of it, and that will probably make her less crazy for a while at least. But that's not the moral solution. If you take all this karmic garbage and make yourself feel better by passing it on to others, that's normal. That's the way the world works. But if you manage to absorb it and not pass it on, that's the highest moral conduct of all. That really advances everything, not just you, the whole world. If you look at the lives of some of the greatest moral figures of history, Christ, Lincoln, Gandhi, and others, you'll see that's what they were really involved in, the cleansing of the world through the absorption of karmic garbage. They didn't pass it on. Their followers sometimes did, but they didn't. On the other hand, Pheadrus supposed, when you're on the receiving end of some karma dump like that, it sets you free. If he'd thrown Lila out when she was insane, it would have bothered him afterwards as something he shouldn't have done. But now, this way, both Rigel and Lila rejecting him, there was no way he was going to feel guilty about her departure. The bond of obligation was broken. If Lila had been full of gratitude and attachment, he would still be stuck with her. Now Rigel had that honor. Across the cabin, on the pilot berth, Pheadrus saw that her suitcase was gone. There was a nice empty hole there. That was good. That meant he could get the trays of slips back out and have room to get to work on them again. That was good, too. He remembered that program slip he wrote to wait till Lila gets off the boat. He could cross that one off now. He wondered if he really did want to go back to all those slips. In their own way, they were a lot of karmic garbage, too. Strictly speaking, the creation of any metaphysics is an immoral act, since it's a lower form of evolution, intellect, trying to devour a higher mystic one. The same thing that's wrong with philosophology when it tries to control and devour philosophy is wrong with metaphysics when it tries to devour the world intellectually. It attempts to capture the dynamic within a static pattern, but it never does. You never get it right. So why try? It's like trying to construct a perfect, unassailable chess game. No matter how smart you are, you're never going to play a game that is right for all people at all times, everywhere. Answers to 10 questions lead to 100 more, and answers to those lead to 1,000 more. Not only would he never get it right, the longer he worked on it, the wronger it would probably get. Then, as he thought about this gloomily, he saw something else in a shadow at the back of the berth. It was the doll. She'd left it behind. That was sort of sad, too. After all the fuss she'd made over it, now she just walks off and leaves it. It left a feeling of immorality, too. What do you think of a small girl who goes off and leaves her doll alone and abandoned? Will she do that when she grows up? He got up and looked at it. It was just an ordinary machine-molded rubber doll, not a very expensive one. It had no moving eyes. Its brown hair was part of the machine molding. He saw that one spot on the head was abraded where it had evidently rubbed against something in the river for a long time, but probably if it had been glued-on hair, it would have all come off by now. There was something really sad about it, sitting there all bare-naked and sexless. Something innocent, something wronged. He didn't like to look at it. He didn't want to be involved with it. What the hell was he going to do with it? He didn't want to keep it on the boat. He supposed he could just throw it overboard. It looked like all the other trash on the beach. No one would know the difference. Probably that's where it was headed anyway before Lila fished it out of the river. Beside it was a shirt that didn't look like one of his. It looked new and clean. He picked it up. There was a sharp pin in it, which he pulled out and set on the chart table. It must really be new, he thought, if it still got pins in it. When he tried to put it on, he couldn't get the buttons buttoned without exhaling. It was too small. It couldn't be one of his. Lila must have left it. What was Lila doing with a man's new shirt? Now he was beginning to remember. She had wrapped the doll in something that looked like this. That's probably where it came from. But why should she have bought a shirt for a doll? She was really into some kind of fantasy world. Well, if that's what she bought it for, to cover up this doll, that seems like a perfect use for it right now. Maybe it would help overcome this wronged feeling the doll gave off. He slipped the shirt over the doll's head. It came down way over the doll's feet, like a nightshirt. That looked better. He buttoned the collar around its neck. Something about this doll was giving it all kinds of quality the manufacturer had never built into it. Lila had overlaid a whole set of value patterns on top of it, and those values were still clinging to it. It was almost like some religious idol. He set it on the edge of the pilot berth and went back and sat down and stared at it for a while. It looked better with the shirt on. An idol, that's what this doll was. It was a genuine religious idol of an abandoned religion of one. It had all those formidable characteristics that idols always have. That's what spooked him. Once they've been ritualized and adored, these idols change in value. You can no more throw them away casually than you can throw an old church statue on the dump. He wondered what they actually did with the old abandoned church statues. Did they have a desanctification ceremony of some sort? He remembered he'd been going to have a funeral for this idol for Lila's benefit. Maybe he ought to give it one for his own benefit, just to put it somewhere without turning it into trash. Funny feelings. Anthropologists could do a lot with idols. Maybe they already had. He seemed to remember a book he always wanted to read called The Masks of God. You could discover a lot about a culture, about what it said about his idols. The idols would be an objectification of the culture's innermost values, which were its reality. The doll represented Lila's innermost values, the real Lila, and it said something about her that completely contradicted everything else. It indicated that there were two contradictory patterns conflicting with some enormous force, and what had happened was some kind of shift in these tectonic plates that had produced a kind of high Richter scale earthquake. The one pattern, the one Rigel denounced, was going away. The doll represented a pattern that was going another way, and so the idol allowed Lila to objectify the other pattern and ease the pressures that were causing the earthquake, and now she's abandoned it. Evidence that she's going back somewhere worse. Maybe not. Maybe to keep from going to somewhere worse himself, he should bury it with dignity. He thought, just for his own benefit. He heard a clunk and realized it was the dinghy. The groceries were still down there. Everything had happened so fast he'd forgotten all about them. He went up on deck, lowered himself into the dinghy, and then lifted the grocery bags up onto the deck of the boat. Now with Lila gone, he had enough food to get to Norfolk at least. It would probably go bad before then. He got back on deck and lowered the canvas bags one by one into the cabin, where he sat them on the berth, and then brought out their contents and put them into the icebox. Then he looked at the doll idol. He picked it up and tucked it under one arm like a child of his own, and brought it up on deck, where he sat it down carefully. Then he stepped down into the dinghy again and brought the doll down and placed it on the stern thwart ahead of him and rowed ashore. Good thing he had the shirt to wrap over this idol if he needed to. If someone came along, he'd have a hard time explaining. The trail passed by low shrubs with small, thick leaves and tiny blue-gray berries. It was paved with small orange-tan stones and sand, and there were pieces of dry grass on it, hollow round reeds broken into 6-inch pieces, about 1/4 of an inch thick, laid in whirligig patterns. He wondered if the hurricane had done that. Ahead, on one side, by some fading goldenrod, was a Department of Interior survey marker. Later on was a nicely made painted sign asking people to keep out of the marsh to protect the wildlife. It was good that the main road to town didn't have access to this area. It made it much more isolated. He heard a honking of geese overhead. He looked up and saw about 30 or 40 geese flying in a V formation northwest, the wrong way. Crazy geese. This warm spell must have gotten to them. Walking along with this idol, Pheadrus felt as if the two of them were sharing this experience, as though he was back in childhood again, and this were some imaginary companion. Little children talk to dolls, and grown-up adults talk to idols. He supposed that a doll allows a child to pretend he's a parent, while an idol allows a parent to pretend he's a child. He reflected on this for a while, and then his mind framed a question. What would you say, he asked the idol, if you were in India now? What would you say to all this? He listened for a long time, but there was no response. After a while, into his thoughts came a voice that did not seem to be his own. All this is a happy ending. Happy ending? Pheadrus thought about it for a while. I wouldn't call it a happy ending, he said. I'd call it an inconclusive ending. No, this is a happy ending for everyone, the other voice said. Why? Because everyone gets what he wants, the voice said. Lila gets her precious Richard Rigel. Rigel gets his precious self-righteousness, and you get your precious dynamic freedom, and I get to go swimming again. Oh, you know what's going to happen? Yes, of course, the idol said. Then how can you say it's a happy ending when you know what's going to happen to Lila? It's not a problem, the idol's voice said. Not a problem. He's going to try to lock her up for life, and that's not a problem? Not for you. Then why do I feel so bad about it? Pheadrus asked. You're just waiting for your medal, the idol answered. You think maybe they're going to turn around and come back and hand you a citation for merit. But he's going to destroy her. No, the idol said, she isn't going to let him get anything on her. I don't believe that. She owns Rigel now, the idol continued. He's had it. From here on, he's putty in her hands. No, Pheadrus said, he's a lawyer. He isn't going to lose his head over her. He doesn't have to. His head's already lost, the idol said. She's going to use all those morals of his against him. How? She's going to become a repentant sinner. She may even join a church. She's just going to keep telling him what a wonderful moral person he is and how he saved her from your degenerate clutches. And what can he do? How can he deny it? There's no way he can fight that. That just keeps his moral ego blown tight as a balloon. And as soon as it starts to sag, he will have to come back to her for more. Phew, this was some idol, Pheadrus thought. Sarcastic, cynical, almost vicious. Was that what he himself was really like underneath? Maybe it was. A theatrical ham idol. A matinee idol. No wonder someone threw it into the river. You're the winner, you know, the idol said. By default. How so? You did one moral thing on this whole trip, which saved you. What was that? You told Rigel that Lila had quality. You mean in Kingston? Yes. And the only reason you did that was because he caught you by surprise and you couldn't think of your usual intellectual answer. But you turned him around. He wouldn't have come here if it hadn't been for that. Before then he had no respect for her and a lot for you. But after that he had no respect for you and some for her. So you gave something to her, and that's what saved you. If it hadn't been for that one moral act, you'd been headed down the coast tomorrow with a lifetime of Lila ahead of you. Pheadrus didn't like it. Judgments of this sort, from a branch of his own personality, were very confusing and somewhat ominous. He didn't want to hear any more of them. "Well, Idol," he said, "you may be right and you may be wrong, but we are coming to the end of the road here." They arrived at what looked like the ruins of an old fortress. It looked somewhat the way old ruins in India looked, except those were many centuries old. It looked sort of like a castle, but it was concrete and broken in places, with thick rusted reinforcing rods emerging from the breaks in the concrete. Part of it looked like the wall of a small amphitheater. Apparently, it was the parapet of an old fort. In one area were remains of an overhead trolley system that might have been for hauling military shells. Huge rings were in a wall, apparently to take the recoil of a large cannon that was now gone. There was a beautiful leafless tree growing out of the middle of the parapet, like an enormous umbrella. It was only about 10 feet tall, but much wider than that. As he walked in the northwest, he could see more clearly how the remains of the old concrete structure had broken into fragments, tilted to one side and fallen into the water. There were square holes in the concrete you could fall through. It looked as though the cracks in the concrete under his feet were ready to break away any time. Apparently, the breaking up and erosion were being caused by settling and probably by the action of the sea. But he guessed that the real destroyer was not the sea, but the great ravager of most military installations, lack of appropriations. It was sort of wonderful to see this old fort, built to assert man's domination over the earth, slowly sinking into the Atlantic Ocean. It certainly looked like an auspicious place for the interment of this idol. He found a gate that led below the concrete to a dark chamber where he could hear water down below gurgling loudly. He entered a door with vertical spiked iron posts and I-beams. It was dark inside, like a grotto. The only illumination came from below. He turned to the right by a pockmarked wall and descended 5 steps leading down to a small drop-off. He descended the stairs, testing the concrete carefully with his foot, went left, went forward, and then right again, into a dark tunnel. There he saw that the light came through a smashed portion of the concrete under which swept the water of the Atlantic. There was enough light to show a dark high-water mark of the tide against the wall. He set the idol against the wall in a sitting position, facing the entrance to the sea, and arranged the shirt around it carefully. Within a few hours, the tide should come and lift it out of here. His mind said to the idol, "Well, little friend, you've had quite a busy existence." He stepped back, did a small bow, with his hands clasped together in the manner he had once learned in India, and then, feeling that things were right at last, turned and left. Back to daylight and good old sanity. A few crickets were chirping. He heard a roar in the sky and looked up and saw a Concorde airplane, slowly circling the south and then rising and speeding. Good old technology. All this 20th century sanity wasn't as interesting as the old days of his incarceration, but he was getting a lot more accomplished, at a social level at least. Other cultures may talk to idols and animal spirits and fissures in the rocks and ghosts of the past, but it wasn't for him. He had other things to do. He had a feeling of freshness as he walked back to the boat. What a fantastic day this was. How many people are ever lucky enough to clean the slate like this? They're all stuck with their endless problems. He stood on a mound of sand beside some juniper bushes and said, "Ah." He threw out his arms. Free, no idols, no Lila, no Rigel, no New York, no more America even, just free. He looked up in the sky and whirled. Ah, that felt good. He hadn't whirled like that for years, since he was 4. He whirled again. The sky, the ocean, the hook, the bay, spun round and round him. He felt like a whirling dervish. He walked back to the boat in a kind of relaxed, nothing-to-do way, thinking of nothing whatsoever. Then he remembered when he had been walking down a dirt road like this one near Lame Deer, Montana, on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. It was with Dusenberry and John Woodenleg, the tribe's chief, and a woman named Laverne Madigan from the Association of American Indians. So long ago, so many things had happened. He would have to get back to the Indians someday. That was where he had started from, and that was where he had to get back to. He remembered it had been spring then, which was a wonderful time in Montana, and the breeze blowing down from the pine trees carried a fresh smell of melting snow and thawing earth. And they were all walking down the road, 4 abreast, when one of those raggedy, nondescript dogs that call Indian reservations home came onto the road and walked pleasantly in front of them. They followed the dog silently for a while. Then Laverne asked John, "What kind of dog is that?" John thought about it and said, "That's a good dog." Laverne looked curiously at him for a moment, and then looked down at the road. Then the corners of her eyes crinkled, and as they walked on, Pheadrus noticed she was sort of smiling and chuckling to herself. Later, when John had left, she asked Dusenberry, what did he mean when he said, "That's a good dog"? Was that just Indian talk? Dusenberry thought about it for a while, and said he supposed it was. Pheadrus didn't have any answer either, but for some reason he had been just as amused and puzzled as Laverne was. A few months later she was killed in an airplane crash, and a few years later, after that, Dusenberry was gone too, and Pheadrus's own hospitalization and recovery had clouded over all memory of that time, and he'd forgotten all about it. But now suddenly, out of nowhere, here it was again. For some time he'd been thinking that if he were looking for proof that substance is a cultural heritage from ancient Greece rather than an absolute reality, he should simply look at non-Greek derived cultures. If the reality of substance was missing from those cultures, that would prove he was right. Now the image of the raggedy Indian dog was back, and he realized what it meant. Laverne had been asking the question within an Aristotelian framework. She wanted to know what genetic, substantive pigeonhole of canine classification this object, walking before them, could be placed in. But John Woodenleg never understood the question. That's what made it so funny. He wasn't joking when he said, "That's a good dog." He probably thought she was worried the dog might bite her. The whole idea of a dog as a member of a hierarchical structure of intellectual categories known generically as objects was outside his traditional cultural viewpoint. That was significant, Pheadrus realized. That John had distinguished the dog according to its quality rather than according to its substance. That indicated he considered quality more important. Now Pheadrus remembered when he had gone to the reservation after Dusenberry's death and told them he was a friend of Dusenberry's. They had answered, "Oh yes, Dusenberry, he was a good man." They always put their emphasis on the good, just as John had with the dog. A white person would have said he was a good man, or balanced the emphasis between the two words. The Indians didn't see any man as an object to whom the adjective good may or may not be applied. When Indians used it, they meant that good is the whole center of experience, and that Dusenberry, in his nature, was an embodiment or incarnation of the center of life. Maybe when Pheadrus got this metaphysics all put together, people would see that the value-centered reality it described wasn't just a wild thesis off into some new direction, but was a connecting link to a part of themselves, which had always been suppressed by cultural norms, and which needed opening up. He hoped so. The experience of William James Sidis had shown that you can't just tell people about Indians and expect them to listen. They already know about Indians. Their cup of tea is full. The cultural immune system will keep them from hearing anything else. Pheadrus hoped this quality metaphysics was something that would get past the immune system and show that American Indian mysticism is not something alien from American culture. It's a deeply submerged hidden root of it. Americans don't have to go to the Orient to learn what this mysticism stuff is all about. It's been right here in America all along. In the Orient, they dress it up with rituals and incense and pagodas and chants, and of course, huge organizational enterprises that bring in the equivalent of millions of dollars every year. American Indians haven't done this. Their way is not to be organized at all. They don't change anything. They don't make a big fuss, and that's what makes people underrate them. Pheadrus remembers saying to Dusenberry just after that peyote meeting was over, "The Hindu understanding is just a low-grade imitation of this. This is how it must have really been before all that claptrap got started." And he remembered that Franz Boas had said that in a primitive culture, people speak only about actual experiences. They don't discuss what is virtue, good, evil, beauty, the demands of their daily life, like those of our uneducated classes, don't extend beyond the virtues shown on definite occasions by definite people, good or evil deeds of their fellow tribesmen, and the beauty of a particular man, woman, or object. They don't talk about abstract ideas, but Boas said the Dakota Indian considers goodness to be a noun rather than an adjective. That was true, Pheadrus thought, and that was very objective. But it was like an explorer noticing that there's a huge vein of pure yellow metal emerging from the side of a cliff, jotting the fact down in his diary, and then never expanding on the subject because he's only interested in facts and doesn't want to get into evaluations or interpretations. Good as a noun. That was it. That was what Pheadrus had been looking for. That was the homer, over the fence, that ended the ball game. Good as a noun rather than an adjective is all the metaphysics of quality is about. Of course, the ultimate quality isn't a noun or an adjective or anything else definable. But if you had to reduce the whole metaphysics of quality to a single sentence, that would be it.